There are very few nations on this planet whose roots stretch as deep into the soil of human history as Iran. This is a land where civilization was not merely visited. It was born here, shaped here, shattered and rebuilt across 5,000 years of unrelenting change. Through Greek invaders and Arab conquerors, through Mongol catastrophe and Cold War manipulation, it is the story of how a civilization survives, how it bends without breaking, absorbs without disappearing, and rises again after catastrophes that would have destroyed lesser traditions. 5,000 years compressed into a single journey from the earliest cities of the ancient plateau, through the greatest empire the ancient world had ever seen, through conquest and cultural renaissance and modern revolution. This is that full story, told from beginning to now. Long before the name Iran appeared in any language or on any map, the Iranian plateau was already teeming with organized human life. The southwestern lowlands of what is now the Khuzestan region gave rise to one of the most consequential early civilizations of the ancient world, Elam, anchored around the magnificent and ancient city of Susa. What distinguished Elam from many of the great civilizations that followed it was the nature of its origins. It was not planted by a conquering army or built by foreign rulers imposed on a defeated population. Instead, it grew organically, shaped by the indigenous people already living across the region who organized themselves from scattered farming communities into complex city-states and eventually into a kingdom with its own royal dynasties, its own administrative systems, and its own writing, multiple writing systems. The Elamites built enormous temples and monumental structures, created sophisticated artistic traditions, and entered into complex networks of commerce and military competition with the powerful civilizations to their west, Akkad and later Babylon. For nearly 2,000 years, Elam was among the dominant powers of the ancient Near East, civilizations whose names have become legendary. But by the 6th century BC, repeated Assyrian military campaigns finally broke Elamite power. The kingdom collapsed, and in the political vacuum that opened in its wake, the conditions were created for the rise of a dynasty that would build the greatest empire the ancient world had ever witnessed. The next great transformation of Iran began not through invasion, but through migration. During the first millennium BC, generational movements of people who reshaped entire regions across centuries rather than decades. Among these migrating groups, two would come to define the future of the Iranian world more than any others: the Medes and the Persians. The Medes arrived first and established the earlier of the two kingdoms. By the 7th century BC, they had united diverse Iranian tribes under centralized authority to create the Median Kingdom, a powerful state capable of challenging even the fearsome Assyrian Empire, which the Medes helped destroy in alliance with Babylon. They ruled from their capital at Ecbatana in what is now the city of Hamadan, and for several decades stood as the dominant power on the Iranian plateau. But it was their southern neighbors, the Persians, settled in the region of Anshan in modern-day Fars province, who would carry Iranian civilization to heights the world had never witnessed. The Persians were at this point a vassal people under Median authority. That was about to change, dramatically and permanently. In 550 BC, a man named Cyrus changed the course of history. He began as the ruler of Anshan, a Persian vassal state under Median authority, but within a few years had defeated the Median king and united the Iranian tribes under a single Persian leadership. That was merely the first act. His armies then swept westward, overthrowing the fabulously wealthy kingdom of Lydia in Anatolia, whose king Croesus was considered the richest man in the known world. Persian forces turned south, and in 539, BC captured ancient Babylon, one of the greatest metropolises, the ancient world, effectively without a prolonged siege. Eastern campaigns extended Persian power deep into Central Asia, an empire stretching from the shores of the Aegean to the borders of India. Where previous empires had crushed the peoples they conquered, imposed their religion and culture, and deported populations to break their resistance, Cyrus took a different path. He permitted local religions and traditions to continue uninterrupted. He allowed displaced peoples to return to their homelands. When he captured Babylon, he specifically authorized the Jewish exiles held in captivity there for generations to return to Jerusalem and rebuild their sacred temple. These revolutionary policies were inscribed on a clay cylinder, the famous Cyrus cylinder, which documented his conquest of Babylon and his restoration of its temples and displaced peoples. Many modern scholars have described the Cyrus cylinder as one of the earliest articulations in recorded history of something resembling the concept of human rights. Under Cyrus and his successors, especially the brilliant administrator Darius I, the Achaemenid Empire expanded and consolidated into the largest political entity the ancient world had ever produced. At its peak under Darius, the empire covered approximately 5.5 million square kilometers, stretching from Egypt to India and from the Aegean coast to Central Asia. His most celebrated campaign was an invasion of Mughal India that brought him to Delhi, where he seized treasures of almost incomprehensible value. But his empire was built on personal military genius rather than durable institutions, and it fragmented almost immediately after his assassination in 1747. The Qajar dynasty emerged in the late 18th century to establish a new Iranian monarchy, but the world they governed was radically different from anything previous Iranian rulers had encountered. The Russian Empire was expanding southward, seizing territories in the Caucasus and pressing toward the Persian Gulf. The British Empire was protecting its Indian colonial interests with growing aggressiveness across the region. Through a series of humiliating military defeats and exploitative treaties, Gulistan in 1813, Turkmenchay in 1828, Iran lost significant territories to Russia. Britain extracted extensive commercial and legal concessions inside Iran's own borders. Although Iran was never formally colonized, it was increasingly a country whose foreign policy was shaped in St. Petersburg and London rather than Tehran. Foreign companies extracted its resources. Foreign advisors shaped its institutions. When oil was discovered in commercial quantities in the early 20th century, the stakes of foreign interference rose dramatically. The accumulated fury of decades of foreign manipulation and royal mismanagement finally erupted in 1906, when a popular uprising forced the Qajar Shah to grant Iran its first constitution and establish a national parliament, the Majlis. For the first time in millennia of Iranian history, the country was reaching for a form of governance constrained by law rather than the unchecked will of a monarch. It was a genuinely revolutionary moment, full of democratic energy and national hope. But the gains proved impossibly fragile. Both Russia and Britain, fearing a strong and independent Iran capable of resisting their influence, quietly backed the counter-revolutionary forces. The constitutional experiment was crushed. Iran slid back into political chaos, worsened by foreign occupation and violence during World War I, when the country, despite declaring neutrality, was fought over by multiple foreign armies. Out of this prolonged disorder emerged Reza Shah, a military commander who seized power in a coup in 1925 and founded the Pahlavi dynasty. He was a man of immense energy and authoritarian conviction who built railways, reformed legal and educational systems, created modern universities, and professionalized the army. In 1935, he officially renamed the country Iran, but his wartime sympathy toward Nazi Germany, hoping German power might counter British and Soviet influence, proved catastrophically misguided. In 1941, Allied forces from Britain and the Soviet Union invaded, forced Reza Shah to abdicate, and placed his young son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, on the throne. Mossadegh, the CIA coup, and the Shah's authoritarian reign. The young Shah initially governed under significant political constraints. In 1951, Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh, a charismatic nationalist lawyer of extraordinary popular appeal, nationalized Iran's oil industry, transferring control from the British-owned Anglo-Iranian oil company to the Iranian state. The logic was simple. Iran's oil was being extracted primarily for the benefit of British shareholders, while Iranians themselves received a tiny fraction of the proceeds from their own natural resources. Britain responded with economic warfare, sanctions, a global oil boycott, and international diplomatic pressure. When Mossadegh refused to back down, Britain turned to America. In 1953, the CIA and British intelligence launched Operation Ajax, a coup that overthrew the democratically elected prime minister and restored the Shah's full personal authority. It was one of the most consequential covert operations of the Cold War era, and Iranians have never forgotten it. After the coup, Mohammad Reza Shah ruled with greatly expanded power, strongly backed by the United States as a key Cold War ally in the strategically vital Middle East. American military and financial aid flowed into Iran in massive quantities. The Shah created Savak, a feared secret police trained partly by the CIA and Mossad that monitored the population-imprisoned critics and tortured dissidents. Simultaneously, he launched the White Revolution, a sweeping program of land reform, industrialization, literacy campaigns, and expanded rights for women. While these reforms brought real modernization to parts of the economy, they also disrupted traditional society, concentrated wealth among elites and regime-connected businessmen, and deepened inequality between the urban wealthy and the rural poor. The contradictions of his rule were most dramatically symbolized by a lavish celebration in 1971 at the ruins of Persepolis, a spectacular gathering of world leaders in the Iranian desert while millions of Iranians lived in poverty. The anger it provoked energized his most powerful critic, a cleric living in exile named Khomeini. The Islamic Revolution of 1979. Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini had been exiled since 1964 for his outspoken opposition to the Shah. From Iraq and then France, he proved impossible to silence. His recorded speeches were copied onto cassette tapes and smuggled into Iran by the thousands, played in homes and mosques across the country. He portrayed the Shah as a tyrant sustained by American power and called for an Islamic government of justice and independence for ordinary Iranians. through the 1970s, as economic inequality widened and political repression intensified, his message gathered unstoppable momentum. By 1978, a nationwide uprising had erupted. What made the Iranian Revolution distinctive was its extraordinary breadth. Secular nationalists and religious conservatives, Marxist students and devout merchants, factory workers and university professors, all poured into the streets together, united by their shared determination to end the monarchy. Every attempt at suppression, arrests, shootings, martial law, only intensified the uprising and drove more Iranians into the streets. On January 16, 1979, the Shah left Iran for the last time. On February 1st, Khomeini returned from Paris to a reception of millions in Tehran. By April 1979, the Islamic Republic of Iran was officially declared through national referendum. The revolution immediately transformed Iran's international position. The new government adopted the principle of neither East nor West, rejecting alignment with both American capitalism and Soviet communism. Relations with Washington collapsed catastrophically when revolutionary students seized the American embassy in November 1979 and held 52 diplomats hostage for 404 days, poisoning the relationship between the two countries in ways that have never healed. Then, in September 1980, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein invaded Iran, calculating that revolutionary chaos had left it militarily vulnerable. He was wrong. The Iran-Iraq War lasted 8 devastating years, killing hundreds of thousands on both sides in trench warfare, chemical weapons attacks, and missile strikes on cities. When the ceasefire came in 1988, the borders were unchanged. All that destruction for no territorial gain. Khamenei, the nuclear crisis, and Iran. Today, Khomeini died in 1989, and leadership of the Islamic Republic passed to Ali Khamenei, who has remained supreme leader ever since, one of the longest-serving heads of government in the world. Under Khamenei, Iran has navigated a difficult and often confrontational geopolitical environment, maintaining ideological firmness while engaging in selective, strategic pragmatism when interests required it. The defining international issue of the 21st century for Iran has been its nuclear program. Western governments suspected Iran of pursuing the ability to build nuclear weapons. Iran insisted its program was for peaceful civilian energy purposes. Escalating international sanctions over many years inflicted serious economic damage and hardship on ordinary Iranians. After years of complex negotiations, the 2015 nuclear agreement, the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, offered a framework. Iran would accept strict and verifiable limits on its nuclear activities in exchange for substantial sanctions relief. For a brief period, a genuine opening in Iran's international relationship seemed to be emerging. In 2018, the United States unilaterally withdrew from the agreement and reimposed comprehensive sanctions under a policy of maximum pressure. Iran progressively reduced its compliance with the deal's nuclear limits. The cycle of pressure and counter-escalation resumed. By the mid-2020s, tentative diplomatic contacts were again being explored, but the fundamental tensions rooted in the 1953 CIA coup, the 1979 hostage crisis, and decades of mutual antagonism proved as resistant to resolution as ever. Iran today is a country of extraordinary complexity, an ancient civilization navigating the pressures of modernity while carrying 5,000 years of history in its cultural memory. It produced Cyrus the Great and the poet Rumi, the Achaemenid Empire and the Safavid cultural renaissance. It was conquered by Greeks, Arabs, and Mongols and absorbed all of them. It was shattered by catastrophes that would have destroyed lesser civilizations, and it rebuilt itself every single time. That pattern of survival, of bending without breaking, of preserving identity through the worst that history can deliver, is perhaps the deepest truth about Iran. And whatever the future holds, that extraordinary story is very far from finished.